The dress had been her mother's. That was the thing Evelyn kept thinking about, standing on the warped wooden platform of the Harland Creek station with the Montana wind cutting through the silk like it wasn't even there. Her mother had worn it in a photograph, a small, yellowed square of a thing that Evelyn had carried in the bottom of her traveling case for 6 years. The dress had been altered twice, the hem let out, the waist taken in, the lace at the collar replaced after a mouse had gotten to the original. She had ironed it herself the morning she left St. Louis, pressing every seam flat with a care that bordered on ceremony. Now the silk was gray with train soot, and the hem was filthy, and a woman on the platform was staring at her with the particular expression that said, "You poor stupid thing," without having to open her mouth. The station master had already gone back inside. Evelyn stood with her traveling case at her feet and a letter in her hand. Not the letter she'd been expecting. Not the letter she'd spent 3 days on a train imagining, the one where Thomas Aldridge would be standing at the end of the platform, hat in hand, maybe nervous, maybe not as handsome as his photograph, but decent enough, kind enough. A man who had written to her 11 times over 4 months and called her a woman of rare quality and the answer to what this ranch has been missing. The letter she had was from his neighbor, a Mrs. Dora Phelps, written in a cramped hand on paper that smelled faintly of camphor. Miss Hartwell, I write this knowing it will reach you too late to prevent your journey, as Thomas gave me your address only yesterday before leaving for Billings. He married Cecile Arnaud 3 Saturdays past. I cannot explain his reasoning and would not insult you by guessing at it. I am sorry you have come so far for nothing. D. Phelps. She read it 4 times. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket because she didn't know what else to do with it. The platform was empty now except for a man loading freight at the far end and a dog sleeping in a patch of November sun that didn't seem to be warming anything. Evelyn picked up her traveling case. It was heavier than it looked, stuffed with everything she owned that mattered, and walked to the edge of the platform and looked at Harland Creek, Montana. It was not much to look at. One main street, a general store with a crooked sign, a livery stable with the doors hanging open. 2 saloons. She could tell from the outside, the kind of establishments that didn't bother with curtains. A church at the far end with a weather vane that had been bent sideways by some past wind and never straightened. Maybe 200 people in the whole town, if you were generous with your counting. She had sold her furniture to help pay for the train ticket. She had given notice at the seamstress's shop where she'd worked for 6 years, told them she was going west to be married, and the other women had looked at her with the specific envy of people who had stopped believing in their own possibilities. She had $63 and some cents in her purse. She had no one to wire. Her father was 3 years in the ground, and her mother had followed him 2 years after that, and the aunt who'd taken her in after that had made it quietly but comprehensively clear that returning was not an option. She stepped off the platform onto the street. The first place she tried was the hotel, a 2-story building with a painted sign that said Reardon's, and a front desk attended by a man with impressive side whiskers who looked at her wedding dress, at her soot-stained traveling case, and then at her face with an expression that she would come to understand was a kind of frontier arithmetic. Lone woman, no husband visible, wedding dress as explanation for itself. "We're full," he said. She looked around the empty lobby. There were 4 chairs, a dead plant, and a cat sleeping on the windowsill. There was no sound from upstairs. "I can see the room register from here," she said. "It doesn't appear to be full." His expression didn't change. "Policy," he said. "Women traveling alone. We've had difficulties." "I have money." "I'm sure you do." He said it in a way that made the words mean something else entirely. She picked up her case and left before she said something she couldn't take back. The general store was run by a broad-shouldered woman named Mrs. Carmichael, who was kinder, mostly. She let Evelyn sit on the bench inside by the stove and didn't say anything cutting about the dress. But when Evelyn explained her situation, the woman's face went through a complicated journey that ended somewhere between sympathy and wariness. "Thomas Aldridge," Mrs. Carmichael said slowly, like she was tasting something unpleasant. "He did marry the Arnaud girl, 3 weeks back. I know that now," Evelyn said. "Did he... Was there some miscommunication between you two, or..." "There was no miscommunication. He wrote to me as recently as 5 weeks ago." Evelyn kept her voice flat and even. She had discovered in the last 2 hours that if she let any feeling into her voice at all, it became impossible to keep speaking. He made an offer of marriage. I accepted. I sold my belongings and traveled here. And now I have arrived. Mrs. Carmichael was quiet for a moment. That's a terrible thing he's done. Yes. I'm afraid I can't. She stopped, started again. My husband doesn't. We don't have the space, is what I mean. And even if we did, folks would talk. A woman alone staying with a family not her own. I understand, Evelyn said. She was getting very good at saying that. She tried 3 more places. The boarding house on the side street turned her away before she'd finished her second sentence. The woman at the church, the pastor's wife, red-cheeked and flustered, said she was sorry, truly sorry, but they simply didn't have the facility for it, you understand, and their charity extended to the local poor. There were limits. She was sure Evelyn could appreciate that. The last place was a laundry run by 2 elderly sisters who looked at her from behind the counter with identical expressions of bird-like suspicion and said nothing at all. By 4 in the afternoon, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped and the sun was getting low and orange over the western hills, which was the only beautiful thing about any of this. Evelyn sat on her traveling case in the alley behind the general store because at least the building blocked some of the wind, and she counted her money twice, as though the number might change, and thought very carefully about what she was going to do. She had $63, a train ticket back to St. Louis, if there was even a train going that direction in the next few days, would cost most of it. And then what? Return to a city where she'd already said her goodbyes and sold her furniture and told everyone she was going west to be married? Walk back into Mrs. Greer's seamstress shop and ask for her position back with what story? She had too much pride for that, or maybe just too much stubbornness. She had been told those were the same thing. She was not going back, which meant she had to find a way to stay. The saloon called itself the Powder Horn, and it was louder and warmer than anywhere else on the street. That was all she was thinking when she pushed open the door. Warmth, and maybe the possibility of asking if they knew of anyone who needed a seamstress, or a housekeeper, or someone to cook. She was not naive about what saloons were. She had grown up in St. Louis, not on a cloud, but she also had limited options, and the temperature outside was now making her fingers ache. The room smelled of tobacco and sawdust, and something spilled that hadn't been properly cleaned up. There were maybe 20 men inside, scattered at tables, and a bar along the far wall tended by a boy who didn't look old enough to be pouring any of what he was pouring. A piano in the corner was being played badly by someone who seemed to be working from memory of a song he'd half forgotten. Every person in the room looked at her when she came in. She was still wearing the wedding dress. She had forgotten about the wedding dress. "Well," said a voice. "Now there's a sight." The man who came toward her across the sawdust floor was perhaps 50, well-dressed by the standards of the room. A dark vest, a watch chain, his hair oiled and combed with evident care. He wasn't unhandsome in a weathered way, the kind of face that had probably been charming once and had learned to trade on the memory of that charm. He smiled at her with most of his teeth showing. "Sterling Voss," he said, extending his hand. "I own this establishment, and you, unless I miss my guess, are the woman who came in on today's train to marry Tom Aldridge." News traveled fast. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said, and shook his hand because refusing would have been worse. "A terrible business," he said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced sympathy. "Tom's a fool, is what he is. Come sit down. Let me get you something warm. No charge." She followed him to a table in the corner because she was cold and tired and her feet hurt, and she had stopped being as cautious as she should have been. He brought her coffee himself, strong and real, and sat across from her with his elbows on the table in a posture of earnest attention. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. "I'm still working that out." He made a sound that managed to be sympathetic and unsurprised at once. "Let me guess. Reardon said they were full. Mrs. Carmichael was sorry, but couldn't help, and the church ladies offered to pray for you." She looked at him. "It's a small town," he said. "I know every door in it." He leaned back in his chair. "Here's what I can offer you, Miss Hartwell. I've got a room upstairs that's decent and warm. My girls," he used the word carefully, "they work the floor evenings, that's all. Keep the men company, keep them drinking. Nothing more than that, not if they don't want."
The pay is fair. I'm a seamstress, she said, and a cook. I'm not.
Nobody's asking you to be anything you don't want to be, he said easily. Come on now, you've had a long day. Just stay the night, get warm. We'll talk in the morning. She looked at him. She looked at the room. She looked at the two women she could now see moving between the tables. One of them caught her eye from across the room and gave her a look that Evelyn couldn't quite read. A warning, maybe. Or just exhaustion dressed up as warning. How much for the room, she said. As a paying guest, nothing else. Something shifted in his face, too quick to catch. $1 a night, he said. I'll pay a week in advance, she said, because she'd learned from Mrs. Greer that paying in advance established a certain kind of relationship, one with at least some protections built in. $7. He took the money and showed her upstairs. The room was decent, as promised. A bed, a washstand, a window that rattled in the wind but kept most of it out. She washed her face and hands and sat on the edge of the bed in her ruined wedding dress and let herself have exactly 10 minutes to feel the full weight of what had happened to her. She used most of them. Then she changed into her traveling clothes, spread the wedding dress over the chair because it needed to breathe, and lay down on top of the quilt with her traveling case wedged against the door, because decent establishments and decent-seeming proprietors were two different things, and she had not been raised a fool. She was right about that. 3 days passed. She ate the meals that were brought up to her, plain food, nothing wrong with it, and went downstairs at off hours to ask Mrs. Carmichael and the other women of the town about work, sewing work, housekeeping, anything that paid. She sent a letter to Mrs. Dora Phelps, thanking her for the warning. She sat in her room in the evenings and mended her traveling dress by the light of the lamp and thought very carefully about her situation in a way that was disciplined and practical rather than despairing, because despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. Sterling Voss knocked on her door the third evening. She didn't open it all the way. Mr. Voss? Miss Hartwell. He was still pleasant, still smiling, but the quality of his pleasantness had shifted in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. I hope you've been comfortable. I have, thank you. Good. A pause. I wanted to talk about your arrangement here. 7 days? That runs out in 4 more days. I'm aware. Thing is, I've had some inquiries. About the room. And about you. She looked at him. From who? Men in town. His voice was very careful, very smooth. Men who've seen you downstairs at meals and thought you were, Well, you're a handsome woman, Miss Hartwell. You must know that. I know what you're suggesting, she said. The answer is no. Nobody's suggesting anything unpleasant. The smile again. These are respectable men mostly, businessmen, lonely. They'd pay well for company. Dinner, conversation, nothing more than what you said 3 days ago, which wasn't nothing. His smile thinned, just slightly. You're in a difficult position, Miss Hartwell. I'd think carefully before. Good night, Mr. Voss. She closed the door and stood with her back against it until she heard his footsteps go back down the stairs. She packed her traveling case that night, not because she had anywhere to go, but because being ready was different from being desperate, and she needed to feel the first thing and not the second. The next afternoon, she was in the bar. She'd come down to eat the noon meal, which was included in her week's rent, when it happened. One of the other women, the one who'd given her the look on her first night, sat down across from her. She was maybe 30, with dark circles under her eyes and a careful way of holding herself like someone braced against regular impact. Her name, she'd said once in passing, was Nan. You need to leave, Nan said, very quietly, not looking at her, like she was talking to her fork. Evelyn kept eating. I know, not in 4 days. Now. A pause. He's done this before. Brings in a woman who's got nowhere to go, lets her feel safe for a week, then makes the situation clear. There's a man coming tonight, a rancher from up the valley. Sterling's had his eye on what that man spends for a while now. He's told me you're going to sit with him at dinner. Evelyn looked at her food. What if I refuse? He'll put your things in the street, tonight. Can he do that? Nan's look said, we both know the answer to that. Evelyn set down her fork. How did you... She stopped. What happened to you when you got here? Nan was quiet for a long moment. I came from Ohio, she said. I had a letter from a man named Cooper, who said he had a farm and needed a wife. I got here, and Cooper was 67 years old and had a face like a boot heel, and 3 other women had already told him no. She paused. Sterling found me at the station. Evelyn looked at this woman, at the careful way she held herself, at the dark circles, at the hands folded in her lap with a grip that was slightly too tight. She thought about the letter in her pocket. She thought about her mother's dress folded over the chair upstairs. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Nan shrugged once and got up and walked back to the bar. It was a measure of how altered her sense of normal had become that when Sterling Voss came for her that evening, not with force, not with anything so crude, just a quiet knock and a quiet request that she come downstairs and join him and his guest for dinner, she went. Not because she'd given in, because she had decided to look the situation in the face rather than have it come at her from behind. The rancher was already there, at the best table, a large red-faced man named Carver, who smelled of horses and whiskey and looked at her the way certain men look at things they intend to purchase. Sterling made introductions with the smooth warmth of a man who dealt in social fictions for a living. He poured wine. He told an anecdote. He watched the two of them with the bright, assessing eyes of someone running a calculation. "Sterling tells me you're newly arrived," Carver said. He had a big voice, the kind that filled a room without trying. "Tom Aldridge's woman, were you?" "No," she said. "I was Tom Aldridge's correspondent. There's a difference." Carver laughed. He seemed to like that. "A spirited one," he said to Voss, like she wasn't there. "I'm right here, Mr. Carver," she said pleasantly. The table went slightly quiet. "So you are," Carver said, and looked at her with more interest than before. "What are your plans, then? In Harland Creek?" "I'm looking for honest work," she said. "Sewing, cooking, housekeeping, teaching. I have references I could provide if—" "She's being modest," Voss said smoothly. "Miss Hartwell is an exceptional woman, very accomplished, very adaptable." She felt the conversation turning in the way that conversations turn when the people in them have a prior agreement that you weren't part of. Her hands were under the table, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to keep them still. "I should be clear about something," she said. She kept her voice very even, very pleasant. "In case there's been any misunderstanding about the nature of this dinner." "Evelyn," Voss said with a warning note. "Mr. Carver," she said, ignoring him, "I'm not here in any capacity other than a boarder in Mr. Voss's establishment. I'm not—" "Miss Hartwell." Voss's hand came down on her arm. Not hard, not yet, but with a pressure that was communicating something beyond its physical weight. "Why don't we not—" She pulled her arm away and stood up. It happened fast after that. Voss rising, his voice dropping to something low and unpleasant, his hand coming back to her arm with a grip that wasn't pretending to be anything else now, Carver watching with the expression of someone who wasn't going to do anything but was curious how it turned out, the bartender boy looking away. The other men in the room very carefully not seeing what was happening. She was trying to pull free. She was not succeeding. She was thinking, with the clear, cold part of her mind that had apparently decided now was the time to be fully operational, that this was where she found out what happened to women like Nan, women like whatever women had been here before Nan. "Let go of her." The voice came from behind her, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had apparently decided it didn't need to be loud to matter. Voss's grip loosened slightly. Involuntarily, she thought, the grip of a man who had been surprised. She turned. There were 3 of them standing just inside the door, a man and 2 boys. The man was tall, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the particular leanness of someone who worked outdoors in all weather and had been doing it for years. He had a week's worth of dark stubble on his jaw and mud on his boots, and a coat that had been good quality maybe 4 years ago. His hat was in his hand. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they were fixed on Voss with an expression that didn't have any heat in it at all, which was somehow worse than anger. The boys, twins, she registered, identical down to the set of their jaws, were maybe 11, 12. They stood slightly behind the man with the braced posture of children who had learned to be ready for situations they couldn't predict. "I said let go of her," the man said again, still quiet. Voss released her arm. He did it slowly, like he was choosing to, but he did it. "Gideon Cross," Voss said. His voice had changed too.
This isn't your business.
Doesn't look that way from here. The man, Gideon Cross, stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, just steady, putting himself between her and Voss with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone moving a piece of furniture. You all right, ma'am? She was not entirely all right, but she was also not going to say so in this room. I'm fine, she said. Thank you. He looked at her once, assessing, direct, no more than a second, and then back to Voss. We came in for supplies and a meal, he said. I'd like to pay for a meal and leave without further trouble. Can we do that? Get out of my establishment, Voss said. He'd found his footing again. His voice had the smooth coldness of a man who knew he had the room. You and your ghost boys, we don't want... One of the twins made a sound, small, involuntary, the kind of sound that comes out before you can stop it. Something moved across Gideon Cross's face, very fast, very contained. Boys, he said quietly, without looking at them. Go wait outside. Pa? One of them started. Outside. Still quiet, still patient. I'll be right there. They went. Gideon Cross set some coins on the nearest table, enough for 3 meals, she'd gauge, and then he looked at Voss one more time. I'll be taking this woman with me, he said, like it was a fact about whether, if she wants to come. He looked at her then. The room was very quiet. Carver had gone very still. The bartender boy was looking at the ceiling. Nan, she could see from the corner of her eye, had pressed herself against the far wall with her arms crossed over her chest and an expression Evelyn couldn't read. She thought about the room upstairs with her case already packed. She thought about Nan's voice at the noon table. Now. She thought about Thomas Aldridge's 11 letters in her case and the folded letter from Mrs. Phelps in her pocket. She thought about $63 minus 7 and what that left her and how many more nights she could afford and what it meant that she couldn't afford more. She thought about her mother's wedding dress draped over the chair upstairs. She'd get it later. Or she wouldn't. Yes, she said. Thank you. Outside, the night was cold and fully dark, and the stars were violently bright in a way that only happened this far from any city. The twins stood by a wagon, a working wagon, not a fancy rig, loaded with sacks and tools covered by canvas. They looked at her with the careful neutrality of children who had learned to reserve judgment. This is Seth, Gideon Cross said, touching one boy's shoulder briefly. And this is Sam, the other one. Boys, this is... He paused, looking at her. Evelyn Hartwell, she said. Miss Hartwell, he said, like confirming it for himself. Seth looked at the wagon. Sam looked at her, and then looked away. Neither of them said anything. She got the sense this was not unusual for them. Gideon Cross looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, but with the direct appraisal of a man who didn't do things without thinking them through first. I'll be honest with you, Miss Hartwell, I don't have a plan worked out. I came into town for salt and saw a situation that needed addressing. I appreciate that, she said. You can't go back in there. No. And you've got nowhere else in town to go. It wasn't a question. He'd been in town long enough to know its shape. That appears to be the situation, yes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hat, which he was turning over slowly in his hands. Then, I've got a ranch 10 miles north of here. It's just the 3 of us since my wife. Since last year. A pause, brief and deliberate, like a door carefully closed. The boys need someone to teach them. I've been putting it off because I didn't know how to find someone decent out here. The pay is room and board and $8 a month. The work is teaching, maybe some help with cooking. That's all. She looked at him. She looked at the boys. Seth, who was looking at the wagon. Sam, who was looking at his boots. She thought about what she knew about this man, which was nothing except that he'd walked into a room and put himself between her and someone with a bad grip, which was, in this specific moment, more than she knew about most people. I have references, she said, from a seamstress shop in St. Louis. They're good references. He nodded. All right. I'd want to be clear about what the position is. Teaching. Maybe cooking assistance. Nothing that isn't said out loud right now. Something in his face. Not offense, exactly. More like recognition. That's clear, he said. Then yes, she said. I'll take the position. Tad. She went back inside for exactly 4 minutes to collect her case and her mother's dress. And she did it without speaking to anyone and without looking at Sterling Voss, who watched her from behind the bar with an expression she chose not to analyze. When she came back out, the twins were on the wagon seat. Gideon Cross took her case and stowed it under the canvas without being asked, with the economy of motion of someone who didn't make unnecessary gestures. She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Seth, who moved over slightly without acknowledging that he'd done so. Gideon Cross climbed up on the other side, collected the reins, and they rolled out of Harland Creek onto the dark road north. Nobody said anything for a long time. The stars were extraordinary. She had never seen stars like that in St. Louis. The sky there was always a little orange from the gaslight, a little smudged. Out here the dark was actually dark, and the stars were actually white, a whole scattered river of them from one horizon to the other. After a while, Sam, she thought it was Sam, said very quietly to no one in particular, "Can she cook?" "Samuel," Gideon Cross said, without inflection. "I was just asking. She's sitting right there." A pause. Then, with the careful courtesy of a child who had been corrected, "Can you cook, Miss Hartwell?" She had been staring at the stars, thinking about Thomas Aldrich's 11 letters and what she was going to do with them, whether she would keep them or burn them, which was the most useful expression of the feeling she had about the situation. "Yes," she said, "I can cook." Sam considered this. "What kind of things?" "Sam?" Gideon Cross started. "It's all right," Evelyn said. She was so tired, and the wagon was swaying, and the stars were doing something to her that she couldn't quite account for. "I can do biscuits, stews, roasts if there's meat for it, pies when there's fruit. I make a reasonable bread." She paused. "I make very good biscuits." Sam seemed to weigh this. "Pa burns the biscuits," he said, not unkindly. "Sam," Gideon Cross said, in a tone suggesting this was known information he'd have preferred remained private. "He does, though," Sam said. "Every time." Beside her, Seth made a sound that might have been a laugh, small and suppressed. She didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead at the dark road and the darkness on either side of it, the black outlines of hills against the brilliant sky. "Well," she said, "we'll see what can be done about that." The wagon rolled on. The wind had dropped. The temperature was brutal but clear. Somewhere out in the dark, something she couldn't see was moving through the grass. A deer, maybe? Or just the wind working through the stems. 10 miles north. A ranch with 3 people in it, and something missing at the center of it, some absence that had a particular shape she hadn't worked out yet. 2 boys who didn't talk much, and a man who talked even less. She was not arriving somewhere. She understood that. She was just not leaving something, which was different. She was buying time with the currency of being useful, and she was good at being useful, and that would have to be enough for now. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the stars and thought, "All right, this is what there is. Work with what there is." The ranch house lights came up in the distance much later, 2 small warm squares of yellow in all that dark. And she thought for a moment, despite everything, that there was something almost like relief in the sight of them. Almost. The ranch house was smaller than she'd expected and larger than she'd feared. That was the first thought Evelyn had when Gideon pulled the wagon around the last curve of the track and the whole property came into view in the thin gray light of early morning. They'd traveled slower than expected, a wheel bogging in a muddy rut for 20 minutes, while Gideon and both boys pushed without asking her to help, which she noted. The main house was a solid log structure, 2 stories, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and a chimney at each end. Functional. No wasted effort in the building of it, nothing decorative, but the logs were well fitted and the roof looked sound. Behind it, a barn, a smaller outbuilding she couldn't identify yet, a fence line disappearing into the dark. Gideon set the brake and climbed down without ceremony. "Boys, help with the supplies. Miss Hartwell, I'll show you where you'll be sleeping." The room he showed her was off the kitchen, small, with a single window that looked out on the side yard, a bed with a rope frame and a decent mattress, a hook on the wall for clothes, and a washstand. Clean. Someone had cleaned it recently, she could tell. There was a faint smell of lye soap, and the floor had been swept. She didn't ask who'd done it or when, because the answer would tell her something she wasn't ready to know yet about the shape of what was missing from this house.
Breakfast is usually at 6, Gideon said from the doorway. He didn't come in. The boys are up by 5:30. I'm up before that. He paused. You don't need to start tomorrow. You've had a long day. I'll start tomorrow, she said. That's what I'm here for. He looked at her for a moment, that same direct look he'd used in the saloon. Not intrusive, just present. All right, he said. Good night, Miss Hartwell. Good night, Mr. Cross.
He pulled the door almost closed, leaving a gap of an inch, which she understood was not carelessness, but propriety. A single woman alone in a house with a widowed man and 2 boys. A gap in the door meant there was nothing to hide. And she lay down on the bed in her traveling clothes and was asleep inside of 3 minutes. She woke before 5. Old habit from the seamstress shop, where Mrs. Greer ran things on a schedule that didn't negotiate. She lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house, wind against the window, a board settling somewhere above her, the distant sound of something in the barn. And then she got up and found the kitchen. It was a decent kitchen, not large, but the stove was a good one, a cast iron range that still had some heat in it from the night before. She found the wood box full, which meant someone had filled it last night after she'd gone to sleep. She found flour, salt, lard, and a crock of buttermilk that was still good. She found a skillet that had been used so long it was the color of a thundercloud, and was, as a result, essentially perfect. She made biscuits. She made them the way her mother had taught her. Not the St. Louis way, which was lighter and a little more delicate, but the old way, the Tennessee way her mother's mother had used, which produced a biscuit that was denser and taller and could sustain a person through a working morning. While the biscuits were in the oven, she found a cured ham hanging in the larder and cut thick slices and put them in the skillet, and she found coffee and got it going. And by the time the house was starting to move above her head, she had a table with food on it. Sam came down first. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table with the expression of someone revising a prior assumption. You actually did get up, he said. I said I would. He sat down at the table without being told, which she noted as a point in his favor. Seth came down 2 minutes later and sat across from him, and then they both looked at her with the careful attention of children who had learned not to want things too openly. Go ahead, she said. Don't wait on me. I'll eat after. Seth reached for the biscuits and then stopped. Should we wait for Pa? I'll keep some warm for your father. Eat. They ate. Sam had 2 biscuits and then a third with the self-conscious speed of someone who is trying not to appear hungry. Seth ate more slowly and methodically. Neither of them said anything, but the silence was not the hostile kind. It was the kind that came from 2 people who had been alone together long enough that they'd stopped filling quiet with words. Gideon came in when they were most of the way through, mud already on his boots, and stopped at the kitchen door exactly as Sam had done, with the same expression. He looked at the table and then at her, and then said nothing for a moment. I said you didn't have to start today, he finally said. I heard you, she said. There's coffee. He sat down. She poured him a cup and put biscuits and ham in front of him and went back to the stove to eat her own breakfast standing, because the table only had 4 chairs, and she had not yet established what was hers, and she was not going to assume. Gideon looked at the back of her head for a moment. She could feel it, and then said, There's a chair, Miss Hartwell. I'm fine here. There are 4 chairs and 4 people. Sit down. She turned around and looked at him. He was drinking his coffee and looking at the table, not at her, with the expression of a man who had said what he'd said and considered the matter settled. She pulled out the 4th chair and sat down. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Sam said to his biscuit, They're better than Pa's. Sam, Gideon said. I already told her you burned them, Sam said reasonably. Seth made the suppressed sound again that might be a laugh. Gideon looked at his coffee cup with the expression of a man who had decided not to have the conversation he was in. I burned them once, he said, without conviction. 4 times, Sam said. I kept count. Evelyn ate her biscuit and said nothing, but something loosened slightly in her chest that had been very tight for the past 4 days. The first week was about learning the shape of things. The boys were supposed to be in lessons from 8 until noon, with afternoons free for chores and whatever boys did in open country when left to themselves. This was the arrangement she proposed, and Gideon agreed to it with the brevity of a man who was relieved to have someone else make the decision. She found the sum total of their educational materials. 1 Bible, 1 arithmetic primer so old it was falling apart at the spine, a geography book missing its last 40 pages, and a spelling workbook that Seth had apparently used to press wildflowers at some point, several of which were still there, flattened between the pages. She taught from what she had and supplemented from what she knew, which was considerable. She'd been a reader her whole life, one of those children who worked through whatever was available with the systematic hunger of someone who understood early that information was protection. In St. Louis, she'd had access to a lending library. On the ranch, she had her own memory, which was good, and the landscape outside, which was extraordinary. Seth was the reader. He'd picked up whatever the previous arrangement had been, lessons from Gideon she gathered sporadic and inadequate, and run with it to a level that was well ahead of where most boys his age would be. When she gave him the damaged geography book, he read the remaining sections in 2 days and then started asking questions about the parts that were missing, not with frustration, but with the methodical interest of someone working on a problem. Sam was different. Sam was not a reader, not naturally, and the arithmetic primer bored him until she discovered, about 4 days in, that he could do calculations in his head faster than she could do them on paper. She gave him a problem that would have taken her a minute to work through. He gave her the answer in 10 seconds, without apparent effort, and then looked faintly embarrassed about it, like it was something he'd been hiding. "That's not a problem," she told him. "That's useful." He looked at her warily. "Pa says I don't apply myself." "To reading, maybe. What about you? Do you think that's true?" He thought about it with the seriousness she was learning to expect from him when he wasn't being wiseacre. "I just don't see the point of reading," he said, "when I can get Seth to tell me what it says." "Seth won't always be there. He's always been there so far." She looked at him. "What happens if you want to read something Seth hasn't read?" Another pause. He was genuinely considering it, she realized. He wasn't just being contrary. "I'd have to ask him to read it first," he said. "And if he doesn't want to?" He stopped. Something shifted in his face. He was smart enough, she could see, to understand where the argument was going. "You're not a bad reader," she said. "You're a bored one. Those are different things." She found a way to teach him through numbers, through measurement, through land surveys, through the mathematics of carpentry and construction. He was at the table an hour past when lessons ended the first time she tried it, chewing his pencil, not noticing he was still there. Seth noticed. He came and stood in the doorway watching his brother with an expression that was very complicated and very private, and Evelyn looked away from it deliberately because it wasn't hers to witness. She had her first real conversation with Gideon Cross on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks in, on the porch after the boys had gone to bed. She'd come out to get some air. The kitchen got hot with the stove going, and she'd been inside all day except for the noon hour, and found him already there, sitting in one of the 2 chairs that faced the valley, a tin cup of something in his hands. She almost went back inside. Then she decided against it because she lived here now, provisionally, and a porch was not a private room. She sat in the other chair, leaving the distance of the armrest between them, and looked out at the valley in the dark. "Thank you," he said after a while, "for what you're doing with them." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not doing anything special. Sam was up an hour past bedtime last night working on something." A pause. "He doesn't do that. He's never done that." She didn't say anything. The valley was dark and very wide. The hills on the far side just a smudged suggestion against the sky. His mother, Gideon started, and then stopped. Started differently. "Martha was better at the sitting down work than I am. She had patience for it. The boys were 7 when she died, which is old enough to know what they lost, but not old enough to have learned what they needed from her yet." He said it flat, without self-pity, the way you said things you'd turned over so many times they'd worn smooth. "I've done what I could." "You've done fine," she said. "They're good boys." "They're strange boys," he said, and it wasn't an insult, just a fact. "They've been out here alone with me for 3 years, and they've gotten strange in the way that happens. Too much time with just each other and not enough with anybody else." She thought about Seth reading the damaged geography book, filling in the missing pages from whatever he could remember from before. She thought about Sam hiding that he could do arithmetic faster than most adults, like it was something to be ashamed of. "Children adapt to what they have," she said. "I know it." He turned the cup in his hands. "That doesn't always make it easier to look at." She glanced at him.
It was too dark to see his expression clearly, but she could hear in his voice the particular weight of a man saying something he'd been carrying by himself for a long time. She understood the impulse and the discomfort of it, the relief of saying something out loud, and the immediate wish to have it back. "They're going to be all right," she said, not as reassurance, as a considered opinion. He was quiet for a moment. "You think so?"
Seth is going to read everything he can get his hands on and know more than anyone around him by the time he's 20. Sam is going to build something, or survey something, or run numbers for something, and he's going to be very good at it. She paused. They just needed someone who paid attention, he said. She looked at the valley again. Someone who had time to pay attention, she said more carefully, because she didn't want it to sound like a criticism. He accepted that without defending himself against it. Another point, she noted, in a column she hadn't decided yet what to do with. They sat on the porch for another half hour without talking much, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her. She'd expected the silences in this house to be the difficult kind, the silences that grew in places where too much had happened and too little had been said. Some of them were, but not all of them. But it was in that third week that she noticed the financial situation. She was not by nature a prying person, but she had practical eyes. She'd been keeping accounts for Mrs. Greer for 4 of the 6 years she'd worked there, and she had developed the involuntary habit of noticing numbers and what they implied. The larder that was thinning faster than it was being replenished. The harness hanging in the barn that had been mended and mended until the mending was the main structural element. The way Gideon looked at the supply list she made out each week and crossed things off it, not in the way of a man with preferences, but in the way of a man with limits he didn't want to explain. She said nothing. It wasn't her business, technically. But she started going through the kitchen with different eyes, cooking in ways that made the most of what was there, stretching a piece of meat across 3 meals, making bread twice a week instead of buying it in town. It wasn't noticeable. She didn't call attention to it. Gideon noticed anyway. "You don't have to do that," he said one evening. She was working out how to turn a ham bone and some dried beans into something that was a meal and not an apology for a meal. She looked up. "Do what?" "Stretch it." She held his gaze. He didn't look away. "I'm good at stretching things," she said. "It's not a problem." He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then decided against it. He picked up his hat and went back outside. She went back to the beans. There was a conversation they were not having, she understood, about the specifics of the ranch's finances and why a man with good land and a work ethic that started before sunrise hadn't translated that into a more stable situation. She filed it away. She would understand it when she understood more. And she'd been here 3 weeks, which was not long enough to understand much. The first sign that things outside the ranch were going to be a problem came on a Saturday when she rode into Harland Creek with Gideon to get supplies. She hadn't been back since the night she'd left. Gideon had offered to go alone, but she'd needed thread and specific things, and she'd said she'd go, because going alone meant more time, and it was more efficient if she came, and she was not going to be afraid of a main street she'd walked 3 weeks ago. That was what she told herself. It was fine, mostly. Mrs. Carmichael was warmer to her than before. Word had clearly traveled about what she was now doing and where she was living, and Mrs. Carmichael had revised her opinion accordingly in the way that people revise opinions when the social math changes. They bought what they needed. Gideon loaded it into the wagon with the boys' help. Then Sterling Voss came out of the powder horn. He didn't do anything. That was the thing. He just stood on the boardwalk and looked at her with the particular look of a man who was letting you know he was thinking about you, and that the thinking wasn't finished. He had his hands in his vest pockets and a small smile that didn't have any warmth in it, and then he went back inside. Gideon hadn't seen it. He was loading the wagon with his back turned. The boys hadn't seen it either. She got in the wagon and said nothing about it, because there was nothing to say yet. Voss hadn't done anything. He just looked at her, and looking at a person wasn't a crime, and she was not going to start a problem that might not happen. But in the wagon on the way back, Seth, who had been facing backward, said very quietly, "That man was looking at you." She turned. He was watching the road behind them with a stillness that was more unsettling in a child than it should have been. "Which man?" she said, though she knew. "The one from the saloon," Seth said. "The one Pa talked to." Gideon's hands on the reins didn't change, but his jaw did, very slightly, the way a jaw does when the teeth come together. It's nothing, Evelyn said, mostly for both of them. People look at people. Seth turned back around and said nothing else. Sam was looking at her with the assessing expression she'd started to recognize, the one he used when he was working out whether what she said was what she meant. She met his eyes and held them until he looked away. Gideon said nothing for the rest of the ride home. What she didn't know, what she pieced together over the next week from things said and unsaid, and the specific shape of Gideon's silences, was that the ranch's difficulties were not purely the result of 3 years without Martha. They had an older origin. The land the Cross Ranch sat on was good land, not the best in the valley, but solid. Reliable water from a creek that ran year-round, grass that came in thick in spring and held reasonably through summer, elevation that wasn't high enough to kill the cattle in a hard winter. Gideon's father had settled it. Gideon had grown up on it and put another decade into it after that. It was not by rights a struggling operation, but 2 years back, a man named Harland Briggs, not the town's founder, who was long dead, but a man who had bought up the town's name along with most of its prominent real estate, had quietly begun acquiring land in the valley. Not buying it outright mostly, because most of it wasn't for sale. Instead, pressure, paper pressure, filed claims about water rights that required expensive legal responses. Questions raised about the original land grants that needed documentation that had to be gathered from places as far away as the territorial capital. Fees, delays, a lawsuit here, a boundary dispute there. Gideon had spent money he didn't have on lawyers he couldn't keep. He'd resolved one claim and another had appeared behind it. The ranch was still his, legally, unambiguously, but he was running it thin because the legal work had taken money that should have gone into the herd and the infrastructure, and the herd was smaller now than it had been 2 years ago, and the infrastructure was being held together with the functional equivalent of prayer and stubbornness. She found this out not from Gideon directly, but from Mrs. Phelps, the neighbor who'd written the letter to warn her about Thomas Aldridge, who turned out to live 4 miles down the road, and who came by one afternoon when Gideon was out on the far pasture with the boys and said she'd heard Evelyn was here and wanted to make sure she was all right. Mrs. Phelps was a compact, direct woman in her mid-50s who had outlived 2 husbands and was clearly not inclined to be careful with words that didn't need to be handled carefully. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and gave Evelyn a thorough accounting of the valley's politics in a way that was simultaneously the most useful and the most alarming thing she'd heard since arriving. Briggs has his eye on this land, Mrs. Phelps said. Has for 2 years. He's got Voss running interference in town. Voss manages his business dealings through the saloon. It's all connected. Claims, fees, legal nuisances. He keeps Gideon tied up with paperwork until the man runs out of money and has to sell. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Why this land specifically? Creek. Mrs. Phelps nodded toward the window and the valley beyond it. Gideon's Creek comes off the high country and runs year-round. Briggs owns the land south of here, and in a dry year, he feels that creek keenly. He wants the water more than he wants the acres. Evelyn thought about Gideon's hands on the supply list, the harness that was mended past the point of mending, the larder she'd been carefully managing. "Does Gideon know you're telling me this?" she asked. "No," Mrs. Phelps said, "and he wouldn't want me to. He's the kind of man who thinks accepting help means he's failed at something." She drank her coffee. "I have no patience for that kind of man, but I've learned to work around it." Evelyn looked at the window and the valley and the creek that was a line of darker green in the late November grass. She thought about the look on Sterling Voss's face outside the saloon. Not just possessiveness, she understood now, but something more calculated than that. She thought about the woman she'd been in St. Louis. Careful, practical, contained. The woman who had decided to come west and had done it with exactly as much information as a woman in her position could gather, which was not very much, and had arrived to find the information she'd had was wrong. You made decisions with what you had, and then you adapted to what you found. That was the only way anything got done. "What can be done about the claims?" she asked. Mrs. Phelps looked at her with something that might have been approval. "That depends," she said, "on whether anyone's willing to make the trip to the territorial capital and look at the actual original documents." "What would those show?" "I don't know." The woman's voice was very even. But I know Briggs doesn't want anyone looking at them, which suggests they'd show something useful. Evelyn turned her coffee cup in her hands. Outside, the creek ran bright and cold in the gray November light, indifferent to everything downstream of it that depended on its continuing. She was a school teacher on a struggling ranch 10 miles from a town where no one had wanted to give her a room. She had no legal standing here, no money beyond what she was saving carefully from her wages, no connections that mattered. But she had the same thing she'd had when she stepped off that train platform in her mother's wedding dress with $63 and nowhere to go. The capacity to look at a situation with clear eyes and decide what to do next. She would learn more. She would pay attention. And she would not, under any circumstances, let Sterling Voss's particular smile intimidate her into looking away. December settled hard on the valley. The creek froze along its edges but not through, which Gideon said was normal. The current was too fast to freeze completely, except in the worst winters, and this year the snow had come steady but not brutal. He said it the way he said most things about the land, with the flat certainty of someone who had read the same passage many times and trusted what it told him. The boys had begun to change in ways she noticed and tried not to make too much of. Sam had voluntarily read 3 chapters of the geography book on a Sunday afternoon and then argued with Seth about what part of the country they'd most like to see, a conversation that lasted through dinner and finished only because Gideon pointed out that neither of them had been further than Billings, and they were speculating about things they didn't know. Seth, who had never seemed particularly interested in the ranch itself, had started asking Gideon questions about the creek and the land boundaries and the history of the property in ways that had an almost legal thoroughness to them. She didn't say anything about that, but she noted it. Gideon started talking to her more, in increments so small she almost didn't register them. At dinner, instead of monosyllables, there were occasionally full sentences. On the porch in the evenings, she'd established that this was a practice she intended to continue, and he apparently had decided the same thing. There were sometimes extended exchanges that qualified as actual conversation. He told her about how his father had built the house, about the winter 4 years back when they'd lost 30 head to a blizzard that came in too fast to move the herd. About Martha. Not much, not directly, but in the way you mention a person who's still present in the rooms of a house even after they're gone, in the objects they chose and the habits they established. She told him about St. Louis, about Mrs. Greer's shop and the other seamstresses and the small, rigid world of a woman who worked for someone else and was good at it and had run out of room to grow, about her mother and the photograph and the dress. She did not tell him about Thomas Aldrich's letters because she had burned them the second week in the kitchen stove before breakfast, and she was done with that chapter. "You could have gone somewhere else," he said one evening, after. "Not Harland Creek, I mean, some other town." "I know. Why didn't you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "By the time I understood the situation in Harland Creek," she said slowly, "I had already spent down most of my options, and I was—" She paused. "I was tired of going backward. I'd already been going backward for years, in the way you do when you're a woman with limited means and you keep taking the safe choice because the risky choice might leave you with nothing." She looked at the valley. "I decided to stop moving backward." He was quiet for a moment. And staying in a strange man's wagon on a dark road at midnight was not backward. "It was forward," she said, "just not in the direction I expected." He made a sound that was closer to a laugh than anything she'd heard from him yet. Brief, contained, but there. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, his profile in the dark, something worn and reliable, like a fence post that had been through a lot of weather. She looked away before whatever she was thinking about, that had time to become a thought. On a Friday in late December, she came back from the barn where she'd gone to find Seth. He'd been helping Gideon with something mechanical and hadn't come in for the noon meal, and found an envelope tucked under the front door. No address on the outside. Just her name, in handwriting she didn't recognize. She stood in the cold looking at it for a long moment before she opened it. Inside, one piece of paper, folded once. 5 words, block printed, no signature. "Voss is not your problem." She stood with the paper in her hand and the wind cutting across the yard, and she read it 3 times and then she folded it back up and put it in her pocket and went inside to start the noon meal. She didn't say anything to Gideon, not that day, but that evening on the porch, she told him about Mrs. Phelps's visit. All of it. The creek, Briggs, the land claims, the territorial capital, and what might be found there. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence that had a different quality than his usual silences. Tighter, with something working in it. Dora Phelps talks too much, he said. She talks exactly the right amount, Evelyn said. You just don't want to hear it. He looked at her. She held his gaze. It's my problem to manage, he said. I've been managing it. You've been losing it slowly, she said, as gently as she could while still being honest about it. There's a difference. He stood up, went to the railing and put both hands on it and looked out at the dark valley. She waited. The lawyer in Billings says the original land grant might have a surveying error in it, he said, finally. If Briggs gets a judge to agree, the creek boundary shifts south by 40 feet, and I lose the main water access. Is there a surveying error? I don't know. The words came out with the weight of something that had been sitting on him for a long time. The original documentation is in the territorial capital, and I haven't been able to. You haven't been able to afford to go, she said. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders in the dark, at the shape of a man who had been holding up more than he should have been holding up alone for longer than was reasonable. She thought about Seth asking quiet questions about the land boundaries. She thought about the note in her pocket and its 5 words. Voss is not your problem. No. But whatever was behind Voss might be. And someone out there, someone who knew enough to write that note and slip it under her door, wanted her to understand the distinction. I can keep accounts, she said, if it would help. I did it for 6 years in St. Louis. Sometimes knowing exactly what you have is useful, even if the number is difficult. He turned around. In the dark, she couldn't read his face, but she could feel him deciding something. All right, he said after a moment. Fine. It was not a grateful response. It was not graceful. It was the response of a man who had been maneuvered into accepting help and knew it and was accepting it anyway because he was out of alternatives. And she understood that and was all right with it. She went inside. In her room, before she slept, she took the note out of her pocket and read it one more time. 5 words. Unsigned. The handwriting was neither Gideon's nor Dora Phelps's nor anyone else she could place. Someone in this valley knew something about what was happening, and they had decided, for reasons she didn't yet understand, that she was the one to tell it to. She put the note in the bottom of her traveling case, under her mother's wedding dress, and went to sleep. The accounts told a story that Gideon already knew and didn't want to see written down. Evelyn spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed, going through what Gideon brought her, a battered ledger, a collection of receipts and legal notices stuffed into a flour sack, letters from the Billings lawyer that were polite and expensive and increasingly inconclusive. She worked through it the way she'd worked through Mrs. Greer's accounts, methodically, without editorializing, letting the numbers do the talking because numbers didn't have feelings about what they said. When she was done, she had a clear picture. The ranch was not failing in the way that ranches failed from bad management or bad luck with weather. It was failing in the way that things fail when someone is deliberately grinding them down. 2 years of legal fees had eaten through what had been a modest but functional reserve. The herd was a third smaller than it had been when the first claim was filed. The lawyer in Billings had billed consistently and produced, by her accounting, very little of practical use. The most recent legal notice, filed 6 weeks ago, the ink barely dry, disputed the water rights not just to the main creek crossing, but to a tributary that fed 2 of the pastures Gideon used for summer grazing. She put the papers in order and left them on the table and went to bed. In the morning, Gideon came down early and found the organized ledger and the sorted papers and stood looking at them for a long time before she came in from her room. The lawyer, she said, pouring coffee, not turning around. What's his name? Alderton, Gideon said. James Alderton. He was recommended by the county assessor's office. She turned around. Who runs the county assessor's office? A pause. She watched him put it together. Watched the thing she'd seen last night move across his face for the first time. The assessor is a man named Cole, he said slowly. He's been in that position since Briggs started buying up valley land. She said. She set his coffee in front of him. He sat down and looked at the ledger and then at her. You think Alderton is working for Briggs? I think Alderton has been doing just enough to justify his fees and not enough to resolve anything, she said. Whether that's incompetence or arrangement, the effect is the same. You've been paying a man to stand between you and your problem without getting rid of your problem. He was quiet for a long moment. That's a serious accusation. I know it. If I take it to anyone, you'd need to be able to prove it, she said. Which you can't yet. She sat down across from him. What's in the territorial capital records, specifically? The original land survey from my father's time. The grant documentation. He wrapped both hands around his cup. Alderton says there may be an error in the boundary description. Alderton says, have you seen the documents yourself? He looked at her. No. Has anyone who works for you seen them? No. She nodded slowly. Then we don't actually know there's an error. We know Alderton says there might be one. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove, and the wind outside, and the sound of one of the boys moving around upstairs. Gideon looked at the ledger for a long time, with the expression of a man who had been told something he already knew and found it no easier to hear for the knowing. I can't go to the Capitol right now, he said. It's January. I can't leave the ranch for that long in January with just the boys here. I know, she said. I'm not suggesting you go right now. Then what are you suggesting? She looked at her coffee cup. I'm suggesting that when it becomes possible, someone should go and look at the actual documents, and that it should be someone who isn't paying Alderton's fees. He said nothing for a moment, then, with the careful tone of a man testing an idea he wasn't sure about. You. I can read a land survey, she said. I spent 4 years doing the records work at Greer's, which included property measurements for alterations. It's not the same, but the principles are similar. She paused. And I'm not involved with any of the parties in a way that would compromise what I found. You're employed by me. As a school teacher, she said, not a legal agent. There's a difference. He turned his cup around in his hands. It was something she'd noticed he did when he was thinking. That slow rotation, like he was checking something for cracks. Let me think on it, he said. She didn't push. She got up and started breakfast. And upstairs the boys' footsteps crossed the floor and headed for the stairs. And the day began in the way days began on the ranch, with ordinary things that needed doing and the larger problems set to one side, because there was no use in standing in the middle of a pasture thinking about the fence when the fence still needed building. January hardened around them. The temperatures dropped to the kind that made the air feel thin and sharp, and the snow came in steady and serious across the open valley. The creek froze along both banks but still ran in the middle, dark and quick under its ice shelf, and Gideon went out every morning to break the ice at the water points for the cattle that were in the near pasture. Evelyn fell into the rhythm of the ranch in a way that surprised her, then stopped surprising her, then became simply what her days were. Mornings she cooked and taught. Afternoons she had carved into pieces, household accounts, mending, and a project she'd begun quietly without announcing it to anyone. A careful reading of the legal notices and filings in the flour sack, working through the language with the same systematic attention she'd given to the accounts. She was not a lawyer. She understood this, but she had found, over years of doing records work, that legal documents were mostly just precise language about property, and precise language about property was something she could parse if she took it slowly. What she was looking for was patterns, repetitions, the specific shape of a campaign dressed up as a series of coincidences. She found it by the 3rd week of January. All 4 of the claims filed against the Cross Ranch in the past 2 years had been filed by the same office. Not Briggs's name directly, but a land company called the Harland Valley Land Trust, which she'd had to go back through 3 of the documents to identify as the consistent filer. The trust's registered agent was a Billings attorney named Pryor. Pryor, she noted from the letterhead on one misfiled document, shared an office address with James Alderton. She sat with that for a full evening before she said anything to Gideon. When she did, on the porch in coats thick enough to make sitting outside a serious undertaking, she laid it out without dramatics because dramatics would have gotten in the way of him hearing it. He was very still when she finished. Same building, he said. Same address on the letterhead. That doesn't prove they're working together, but it's not nothing. No, she said. It's not nothing. He got up from his chair and went to the railing and did the thing he did when the weather was very cold and he was very angry, which she'd observed twice before. He put both hands on the railing and looked out at the dark for a long time without speaking. His breath came out in visible clouds. "I paid that man," he said, very quietly, "for 2 years. I know. He sat in my kitchen and told me the claims were complicated and these things took time." A pause, each word separate. "He sat at that table." She said nothing. There wasn't anything useful to say. After a while, he came back and sat down. "I need to go to the capital," he said, "as soon as the weather breaks enough to make it possible." "Yes, I can't take the boys." "I'll be here," she said. He looked at her. In the cold dark, his face was hard to read, but she'd gotten better at reading it over the past 2 months, better at the specific language of a man who communicated mostly in silences and small gestures. What she saw now was something between gratitude and the difficulty of accepting it. "I don't like leaving them," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "They'll be fine with me. You know that." After a moment, he nodded. Once, slowly, like he was agreeing to more than just the plan. The break in the weather came in mid-February. Not warm, but a stretch of clear days that made travel possible. Gideon packed a bag the night before he left and told the boys at dinner. Sam took it in stride with the studied nonchalance of a child who was pretending something didn't bother him. Seth was quiet through the whole meal, which was not unusual for Seth, except that it was a different kind of quiet than usual, the kind with something working in it. When the boys had gone upstairs, Seth came back down. Gideon was at the table with the papers he was taking with him. Seth stood in the kitchen doorway in his socks and his nightshirt, looking at his father with an expression that was so adult and so young at the same time that it was almost hard to look at directly. "How long?" he asked. "Week, maybe 10 days, Gideon said. He didn't look up from the papers because he was that kind of father, the kind who showed his children care by being matter-of-fact about it, so they wouldn't feel the weight of being worried over. "Depends on what I find there." Seth was quiet for a moment. "Is the land going to be all right?" Gideon looked up then. He looked at his son, this boy who had been asking questions about water rights and surveying for weeks, who had apparently been paying more attention than anyone had realized. "I'm going to find out," he said. "That's not the same as yes." "No," Gideon said. "It isn't. But I'm going to do everything I can." He paused. "That's all anybody can do, man." Seth stood there a moment longer, then he said, "I already looked up how surveys work. In the geography book. The back part that's missing, I found a different book at Mrs. Phelps. She let me borrow it." Gideon stared at him. "I thought it might be useful," Seth said, with a dignity that was somewhat complicated by the fact that he was 12 and in his socks, to know how they measure things. Evelyn, who had been standing at the stove where she was not part of this conversation, looked very carefully at the wall. Gideon said, after a moment, "Come here." Seth crossed the kitchen, and his father put a hand on his shoulder. Brief, firm, the way Gideon touched his children when words weren't available, and then let go. "Go to bed," he said. "I'll be back before you know it." Seth went upstairs. Gideon looked at the papers on the table and then at Evelyn and said nothing, which was also a thing he did when the thing he was thinking was too close to say out loud. She handed him coffee and sat down across from him, and they worked through the documents together for another hour, her explaining the patterns she'd found and him asking the kind of questions that had the precision of a man who had been working his land for years and understood its specifics in his bones, even if not on paper. When he left before dawn the next morning, she stood on the porch with both boys and watched the wagon go. And Sam said, "He'll be fine," with the air of someone saying it as much for himself as for anyone else. "He will," she said. Seth said nothing, but he stayed on the porch longer than Sam did, looking down the empty track until there was nothing to see. The days without Gideon had a different texture. Not worse, exactly. She managed the mornings and the lessons and the cooking and the small crises that farms produced reliably, regardless of the season. A fence section down in the south pasture that she and the boys repaired badly but sufficiently, a blocked drainage channel that took half a day, a cow that had gotten into something and needed watching. She was competent, and the boys were more useful than she'd expected, capable of hard work without complaint when the work had a clear purpose. But the house was different. There was an absence in it that was felt rather than explained, in the way that the absence of a load-bearing wall would be felt even by someone who didn't know the term. She noticed it mostly at dinner, when the table had 3 people at it instead of 4, and in the evenings when the porch had 1 chair and she didn't sit in the other one. On the 5th day, the trouble started. She was inside with the boys at the lesson table when she heard a horse in the yard. She went to the window and looked out and saw 2 men she didn't recognize coming through the gate on horseback, moving with the particular slowness of men who wanted to be seen approaching rather than surprising. She told the boys to stay at the table and went outside. The men were big, both of them, the anonymous kind of big that certain men for hire develop. Useful bodies, not much else on offer. One of them had a folded paper in his hand. "Ma'am," he said. He tipped his hat with a pleasantness that didn't reach his eyes. "This Cross's place?" "It is," she said. "Mr. Cross is away on business. I'm his employee. What can I do for you?" A glance between them. The one with the paper, she could see it was a legal document of some kind, official paper, the kind with a seal, held it out to her. "Got a filing. Court requires acknowledgement." She took the paper and read it standing in the cold yard with the 2 men watching her. It was a new claim, filed by the Harland Valley Land Trust, asserting that the current occupants of the property were in violation of the original land grant conditions by failing to maintain adequate water management infrastructure along the creek, which failure, they alleged, constituted grounds for forfeiture of the associated water rights. Water management infrastructure. That was the new angle. She read the filing twice to make sure she had it right, and she did. "What does acknowledgement mean legally?" she said. "Receiving this document." The man with the hat-tipping pleasantness said, "Just means you got it, ma'am. Doesn't mean you agree." She went inside and came back with a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, on the document's back margin, "Received by Evelyn Hartwell, employee, on behalf of Gideon Cross, owner, this 14th day of February, 1887. Receipt does not constitute agreement or acknowledgement of the claims herein." She signed her name and handed it back. The man looked at what she'd written. His expression shifted slightly. "Just supposed to get a signature," he said. "You have one," she said. "Noted as receipt only. Is that all?" They left. She stood in the yard until they were through the gate, and then she went inside and sat down at the table and put her hands flat on it to stop them from shaking. Seth was watching her from across the table. Sam was pretending to be looking at his arithmetic. "What was that?" Seth asked. "A legal document," she said. "I'm going to write to your father tonight." She looked at her hands. The shaking had stopped. "Keep working on your problems." Sam looked up. "Was it about the land?" "Yes." "Is it bad?" She considered the question seriously, which she did when the boys asked things directly. "It's not good," she said. "But it's also not the end of anything. It's a piece of paper, and paper can be answered with paper." She looked at both of them. "Your father is in the right place to answer it. Carry on." She wrote to Gideon that evening and sent it with the Phelps's ranch hand who came by every few days on errand runs. She included the exact language of the new filing and everything she'd noted about its specific claims, and at the end she wrote, "The timing is not accidental. They know you're away. I am keeping records of everything." The response came not from Gideon, but from someone she hadn't expected. Margaret Whitlock arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a well-maintained buggy, driven by a young man who was evidently in her employ. She was somewhere in her late 50s, tall in the way of a woman who had never been inclined to make herself smaller, with white hair pinned severely back and eyes that were very sharp and very direct. She wore good clothes without being ostentatious about it. The clothes of a woman who had money and considered showing it off a waste of effort. She had not sent word ahead. She stepped out of the buggy and looked at the house and the yard with the assessing expression of someone who did this sort of appraisal regularly. And then she looked at Evelyn, who had come out to the porch and said, "You're the Hartwell woman." "I am," Evelyn said. "And you are?" "Margaret Whitlock. I own the Whitlock Holdings, about 12 miles east of here." She came up the porch steps without being invited, which would have been rude if her manner hadn't somehow made it seem like the natural order of things. "I'd like to talk to you. May I come in?" She was already on the porch. Of course, Evelyn said. I'll put coffee on. Margaret Whitlock sat at the kitchen table with the ease of someone accustomed to being at kitchen tables she didn't own, and looked around the house with the same assessor's eye she'd given the yard. Evelyn made coffee and set it down and sat across from her and waited. I sent you a note, Margaret Whitlock said. Evelyn looked at her. 5 words. Seemed like enough. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. I wanted to see what you'd do with them. What have I done with them? You went through his paperwork. You found the prior Alderton connection. She said it flatly, like citing a fact. Dora Phelps tells me things, Miss Hartwell, and I've been watching this situation longer than you've been in the valley. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. How long have you been watching? Since Briggs filed the first claim, 2 years. She drank her coffee without remarking on it. I know what he's doing, and I know how he's doing it, and I haven't been able to stop it because I haven't had the right leverage. Knowing something and being able to prove it are different things, as you've likely figured out. I have, Evelyn said. What do you know? Margaret Whitlock set down her cup. Briggs has been using the Harland Valley Land Trust as a vehicle for 2 things: legitimate land acquisition, which is his cover, and fraudulent claims against properties he wants but can't buy. The trust's filings have a pattern that isn't visible if you look at each one separately, but if you look at all of them together, across the valley, over time, it becomes clear, Evelyn said. Yes. A look that might have been approval. Voss runs the social and information side. He knows everyone's business through the saloon, he manages the pressure in town, and he has connections with several of the county officials who are making Briggs's legal work easier than it should be. She paused. There are at least 3 other families in this valley who've been affected the same way Cross has. 2 of them have already sold. The 3rd is barely hanging on. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, thinking. Why come to me? You clearly have resources. You could pursue this yourself. I've tried. Her voice was dry. I'm a woman with money and no husband, which means I have a certain amount of influence and a significant amount of being dismissed. I have a lawyer in Billings who is honest, which distinguishes him from Alderton, but he's told me that without someone willing to present this to the court publicly, to stand up and say what happened to them with documentation, it's very difficult to bring it as a pattern rather than a series of individual disputes. Evelyn looked at the window. The February light was thin and white, bouncing off the snow in the yard. You need a plaintiff, she said. I need several, Margaret Whitlock said. But Cross's situation is the clearest case, because he's been the most resistant and therefore the most thoroughly documented. What Briggs has done to this ranch is the full picture, if we can assemble it. The other families are afraid. And Gideon Cross... A pause. He's not afraid, but he's been managing this alone, which means he's been managing it badly. Evelyn looked at her. The word came out calmly, but it landed with weight. He's a proud man, Evelyn said. Most men are. It's often inconvenient. She picked up her coffee again. The territorial capital, he's there now? Yes. Looking at the original survey documents. Good. Margaret Whitlock nodded once. Tell him when he gets back that my lawyer's name is William Garrett. Honest, as I said, and more importantly, he's seen the pattern in the trust filings before. He's been building a case for 8 months. He needs Cross's cooperation and documentation to complete it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You said you need someone willing to stand up publicly, in court. I did. That means Cross. It means Cross, and anyone else I can persuade. Her eyes were direct. It might mean you, Miss Hartwell, depending on what can be proved and what witnesses become necessary. You've received a legal filing on his behalf. You're involved now, whether you intended to be or not. Evelyn thought about the 2 men in the yard with their pleasant hat-tipping and their folded paper. She thought about Nan in the saloon with her arms folded across her chest. She thought about the women she'd heard nothing of, the ones who'd been here before Nan, who had come and gone in whatever way women went when they ran out of options in a town like Harland Creek. There's something else, she said. Margaret Whitlock waited. Voss. Evelyn looked at her steadily. The land scheme is one thing, but Voss, what he does with women who arrive alone and have nowhere to go, that's separate. Or maybe it isn't separate, maybe they're connected, but either way it should be part of whatever case is being built. Something moved in Margaret Whitlock's face, very controlled, but present. "You're not the first woman to say that to me," she said. "And you're right that it should be addressed. My lawyer is gathering what he can on that front, but it requires women who are willing to speak. Most of them—" She stopped. "Most of them have found ways to survive and don't want to revisit the alternative." "I understand that," Evelyn said. She did. She understood it completely. But if it's possible to make it part of the case, to address both things at once. "It's possible," Margaret Whitlock said. "Difficult, but possible." A pause. "You'd have to stand up and describe what happened to you, in public, with men in that room who have an interest in calling you a liar." Evelyn thought about the saloon, about Voss's hand on her arm, and the specific quality of a room full of men who are very carefully not seeing what's happening. She thought about the 2 minutes she'd stood in that room before Gideon Cross had walked through the door, and what the calculations had looked like during those 2 minutes. "I know what he is," she said, "and I'm not afraid to say it in a room." Margaret Whitlock looked at her for a long moment with the eyes that didn't miss much. "No," she said, "I don't imagine you are." Gideon came back on a Thursday, 8 days after he'd left, thinner in the face from the travel and the cold, and something else she recognized as the specific depletion of a man who had spent a week finding out that what he'd suspected was worse than he'd thought. He came in after dark, after the boys were in bed, and she had food kept warm on the stove because she'd been listening for the wagon. He sat at the table and ate without talking, and she let him, and when he was done, she poured coffee and sat across from him and waited. "There's no error in the survey," he said. She looked at him. "The original grant is clean. The boundary is exactly where my father said it was. The creek is fully within the property." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Briggs's claim about a surveying error is fabricated. Alderton either knew that and didn't tell me, or never looked at the actual documents, which amounts to the same thing." She exhaled. She hadn't realized how much of the weight of the past week had been the possibility that the documents would say something different. "I have copies," he said. He put a hand into his coat and set a rolled document on the table. "The land office made them, certified. Took most of what I had left, but I have them." She looked at the document. "Then Briggs's claims fall apart. If I can get them in front of a judge who isn't in his pocket, yes." He looked at her. "That's the problem. The county court—" "Margaret Whitlock came while you were gone," she said. He stopped. She told him everything. The meeting, Garrett, the pattern of trust filings, the case that had been building for 8 months. She told him about the other families, the 2 that had sold and the one that was barely holding on. She told him about Voss and the women and what adding that to the case might mean. He was very still through all of it. His coffee went cold and he didn't touch it. When she finished, he said, "Whitlock, Margaret Whitlock wants to help." "She has been helping," Evelyn said, "for 8 months. She's just been waiting for the pieces that she didn't have." He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen settled around them, the stove, the wind outside, the house above them with his son sleeping in it. "I should have asked her 2 years ago," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said, because she wasn't going to disagree with that, and because she thought he needed to say it out loud more than he needed her to soften it. He looked at the table. "It's going to be ugly," he said. "If this goes to court, they'll come after. They'll say whatever they can." "I know. About you, about why you're here, how it looks, a woman living on a man's property." "I know," she said again, more steadily. "I've thought about that. It doesn't change anything." He looked up at her. "Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name. Not Miss Hartwell, not you. Her name directly. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did, and something in his expression shifted. Not embarrassment exactly, but a kind of catching himself in the middle of something. "They're going to come after the ranch before it gets to court," he said, completing the sentence in a different direction. "When they understand I've got the certified documents, they'll escalate." She thought about the 2 men with the legal filing and their pleasant expressions. She thought about the note she'd sent Gideon, "The timing is not accidental," and about what escalation looked like when the men doing the escalating had been doing it successfully for 2 years and had no reason to think this time would be different. "Then we need to be ready," she said. He nodded. He picked up the coffee cup and it was cold, and he drank it anyway, which she'd noticed he did. Drank things regardless of their temperature, like the temperature was irrelevant information. "In the morning," he said, I want to look at everything you and Whitlock have put together. I'll have it on the table." He got up and took his cup to the wash basin and stood there a moment with his back to her.
"Thank you," he said, "for the week, with the boys and the—" He didn't finish the sentence. "They did well," she said. "I know they did." He turned around and looked at her with the direct look she'd come to understand meant something he wasn't going to say out loud. "I know." He went upstairs.
She sat at the table for a while longer, her hands around her own cup, looking at the rolled document with the certified copy of a land grant that said the creek was Gideon Cross's, clear and unambiguous, exactly as it had been the day his father dug the first post hole of the first fence on this land. Outside, the creek ran under its ice in the dark, moving fast and cold and entirely indifferent to everything that had been plotted against it, continuing toward wherever water went when it had come this far and was still going. She was not afraid. She recognized the feeling carefully, the way you recognize something you haven't felt in a while and want to make sure you're identifying it right. No, not afraid. Something else. Something that felt, despite everything, a great deal like being ready. The escalation came 9 days after Gideon returned, on a night when the temperature had dropped back to something serious and the snow was coming in sideways off the northern hills. Evelyn heard it first. She'd always been a light sleeper, a habit from the seamstress shop years, when she'd shared a boarding house wall with a woman who kept irregular hours and she'd learned to surface quickly from sleep and assess whether what woke her required action. What woke her this time was not a sound so much as a change in the quality of the dark outside her window, an orange quality. The particular orange that had no business being in a February night on a ranch 10 miles from any town. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake, and when she saw the barn, she was running for the door before she'd formed a conscious thought about it. "Fire!" she was shouting, already in the hallway, already hitting the base of the stairs. "Gideon, fire! The barn!" She heard him above her, the immediate no-hesitation sound of a man who woke into full function. And she was pulling on her coat over her nightclothes when he came down the stairs with his boots in his hand, and then he saw the orange through the front window and said something she'd never heard him say before, flat and quiet, and went out the door. The boys were behind her on the stairs. She turned and looked at them, Seth white-faced and rigid, Sam's eyes wide and awake in the way of a child trying very hard not to be frightened. "Get dressed," she said. "Boots, coats, fast." "Is it?" Sam started. "Fast," she said again. "Both of you." She went out. The barn's south end was fully involved. That was what they said in St. Louis when the fire department came, and it meant what it meant here too. The fire had been burning long enough to have purchased the structure, to have made the wood its own, and the wall facing the house was sending sparks up into the dark on the wind. She could hear the horses before she saw them. That specific register of animal panic that was one of the most desperate sounds she knew, high and rhythmic and wrong. Gideon had the barn doors open and was going in, which she understood was not reasonable and also completely inevitable for the man she'd spent 3 months watching, and she was 20 feet behind him, and then the boys were behind her, and Seth was grabbing her arm and saying, "Evelyn, the pump." And she turned, and he was right. The pump was at the side of the house, and there were 2 buckets beside it, and she said, "Sam, go with Seth, pump water, keep pumping, don't stop." And she went into the barn. The smoke was immediate and serious. She dropped low the way she'd heard you were supposed to and followed the sound of the horses and found Gideon at the first stall. He had the first horse out by the halter, the animal fighting him, its eyes showing white all around, its hooves striking the floor in a rhythm that had nothing to do with reason. He got it through the door, and then he was back in, and she was at the second stall. And the horse in there was a mare named Cora, who she'd fed carrots to on Sunday mornings, and who trusted her mostly, and she talked to her in the low, steady voice she'd found worked better than pulling and got her out. They got all 3 horses out. They got the 2 milk cows out. The goat got herself out, which was consistent with the goat's general approach to existence. The boys had the bucket line going with a competence that suggested they'd either been taught this or had enough plain sense to figure it out. And Mrs. Phelps, who had apparently seen the orange from her place 4 miles down the road, because some people had that kind of attention to their neighbors, arrived on horseback with her ranch hand and 2 more buckets in the time it took Evelyn to make 2 runs with water that they all knew was not going to save the south wall. They saved the north end. The animals were safe. The tack room, which was on the north side, survived. What they lost was approximately a third of the barn, the hay stored in the south section, and a set of tools that had belonged to Gideon's father. When there was nothing left to fight, Gideon stood in the snow in the yard and looked at what was left of his barn with an expression that Evelyn could not look at directly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was private. The face of a man absorbing a thing in the way you absorb it when you're past the point of visible reaction and into the country where things simply settle on you and you carry them. Seth was beside him. He didn't say anything. He just stood there next to his father in the snow with the same stillness. And after a moment, Gideon put a hand briefly on the back of his son's neck, and Seth leaned into it once, and then they both went back to looking at the barn. Sam came to stand beside Evelyn. He smelled of smoke, and his face was streaked with ash, and his eyes had the overbright quality of a child who has held himself together through something and is now approaching the edge of what holding together costs. "It wasn't an accident," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I don't think it was." "Who did it?" She looked at the barn, at the specific pattern of the burn, the way it had started at the south corner, away from the house, the place you'd start a fire if you wanted it to catch fully before anyone noticed. "I don't know yet," she said, "but it's not a mystery." He was quiet for a moment. "Will Pa go after them?" She thought about what Gideon would do, the man she'd spent 3 months watching, and she said, "Your father is going to do exactly what he said he was going to do. He's going to take it to court." She paused. "That's harder in some ways, but it's better." Sam looked at the barn. "They burned it because we're fighting back," he said. "Yes." He was quiet again for a long moment with the expression of someone working through a moral equation. Then, "They must be scared of us then." She looked at him, this 12-year-old boy with ash on his face and someone else's fear under his skin. "That's exactly right," she said. Mrs. Phelps came to stand beside her, smelling of smoke and horse, and said nothing for a while, and then, "This changes the timeline." "I know," Evelyn said. "Garrett needs to know by morning. I'll write tonight." It was Margaret Whitlock who moved fastest. By the time Evelyn's letter reached Billings, Whitlock had already sent word to Garrett, and Garrett had apparently been waiting for something exactly like this. A provocation clear enough to attach to the existing documentation in a way that changed the nature of the case from a land dispute to something with criminal dimensions. Arson was not a civil matter. Garrett came to the ranch 2 weeks later, a spare, precise man in his 50s with a face like a folded map, and the manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people lied to him and had become very good at the specific patience required to wait for the truth to surface. He sat at the kitchen table and went through everything. The legal filings, the prior Alderton connection, the certified survey documents, Evelyn's notes on the pattern of the trust's claims, and then the fire. What they'd observed, when they'd observed it, what the specific burn pattern suggested. He asked Evelyn questions for 40 minutes. Direct questions, precise questions, the kind that didn't allow for approximation. She answered them the same way she'd given him the documents, without editorializing, with the precision she'd learned from years of keeping records that needed to hold up to scrutiny. When he was done, he folded his notebook and looked at Gideon and said, "I can take this to the circuit court. Not the county, Chefs. The county is compromised, as Miss Hartwell's documentation suggests. The circuit judge is based in Billings and has no apparent connection to Briggs's operations." A pause. "This will be a public proceeding. Everything in these documents will be aired. Briggs will bring whatever he can against you, against your situation, against anyone associated with your claim." "I know," Gideon said. "The case will be stronger with additional plaintiffs. The Hennessy family. The third property, I understand, is still in the valley." "I'll talk to them," Gideon said. Garrett nodded. "Miss Hartwell." He looked at her. "The incident at the Powderhorn, your arrival in Harland Creek, what occurred there? I'd like to include that in the case against Voss as a secondary matter. It establishes his pattern of behavior with vulnerable women, which speaks to the coercive social control he exercises in the town on Briggs's behalf." He paused. "That means you'd need to testify, in open court, about what happened." She held his gaze. "I understand. They will attempt to characterize you in certain ways. Your reasons for being here, your relationship to Mr. Cross. I understand what they'll do," she said. "I've thought about it. Garrett looked at her for a moment in the way he apparently looked at things he was assessing. "All right," he said. He picked up his hat. "I'll begin filing within the week. The hearing will likely be set for April." After he left, the kitchen was quiet. The boys were at the lesson table but weren't working. They were watching the adults with the particular attention children gave to situations they understood were consequential. Gideon looked at Evelyn. She looked back. "You don't have to testify," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do." He looked like he was going to argue. She waited. "It'll be ugly," he said. "I know." "Evelyn, Gideon," she said it quietly but directly. "I came to this valley in a wedding dress with $63 because I believed a man's letters, and he turned out to be a liar. I have been called a fool for that by everyone who knows about it, including, occasionally, myself." She paused. "I am not going to let Sterling Voss or Harland Briggs or anyone else make what happened to me in that saloon something I'm ashamed of, because I didn't do anything shameful. They did." She held his gaze. "I'll testify." He was quiet for a moment, then he said simply, "All right." Sam was looking at his arithmetic. "Good," he said to his paper. Seth said nothing, but he turned back to his geography book with a satisfaction that was visible even from across the room. March came in like it meant business. The snow softened and then hardened again, and the creek ran higher with the melt, pushing its ice shelves out from the banks. And the ranch had the particular charged quality of a place where a lot needed to happen before the season changed. They rebuilt the barn's south section, not to its original state, there wasn't money for that, but sound, functional, weather-tight. Gideon and the boys did most of the work, with help from the Phelps ranch hand on the heavy lifting days, and Evelyn fed everyone and kept the accounts of the lumber costs and watched the structure go back up with the feeling of something being reasserted rather than built new. The town's relationship to the situation had been shifting since word got out about the fire. Harland Creek was small enough that everyone knew everything within a few days, and arson on a family ranch in the middle of winter was something different from a legal dispute. It was physical, it was visible, it was the kind of thing that made people who'd been sitting back and watching recalibrate their position. Mrs. Carmichael had sent a basket of supplies the week after the fire without accompanying explanation. The pastor's wife, who had turned Evelyn away that first night, came by and was awkward and flustered and brought a pie, which Evelyn accepted without comment. The Hennessy family, who Gideon rode out to see in early March, agreed to be included in the case on the third conversation after the eldest Hennessy son said quietly that they'd been waiting for someone to go first. The thing about going first, Evelyn had come to understand, was that it was not actually about courage in the way that people described courage. It was about the calculation being different. For 2 years, the calculation for everyone in the valley had been, the risk of fighting is greater than the cost of losing slowly. Gideon's documents changed that calculation. The fire had changed it further because it made visible what the cost of losing slowly eventually looked like. And what it looked like was your barn on fire in February while your children stood in the snow. She was working through one of her now regular letters to Margaret Whitlock. They had developed a correspondence that had become genuinely useful in a way that she valued. The older woman sharp and direct and unbothered by what people thought of her in a way Evelyn was still learning. When she heard the horse in the yard, she looked out the window first. Habit now. She did it without thinking. 2 riders. She didn't recognize either of them, which had a specific meaning at this point. She went to the foot of the stairs and said, "Boys?" And Seth appeared at the top of the stairs and she said, "Get your father from the south pasture. Not running, just go." And he went without asking why. She went outside. The 2 men were not the same 2 who'd brought the legal filing in February, but they had the same quality. The useful body quality, the pleasant expression quality that was doing work to cover something else. One of them was holding a piece of paper, but he didn't offer it to her. "Looking for Cross," he said. "Mr. Cross is on the property," she said. "He'll be here shortly. Is there something I can help you with?" The man looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral. "We're here with a message from Mr. Briggs." "Mr. Briggs can put his messages through his attorney," she said, "as Mr. Cross has requested. This isn't that kind of message." He looked around the yard. The new lumber on the south end of the barn, the tracks in the mud, the everyday evidence of a working ranch. His eyes came back to her. Mr. Briggs is prepared to make a final offer on the property. Fair price. He's willing to settle all outstanding claims and cover relocation costs. He paused. He'd like an answer before the court date. She looked at him. That's his offer. It's a generous offer, considering the barn, she said. His expression didn't change. Considering the legal situation. She heard Gideon behind her. Not running, just the particular cadence of a man coming from the far end of his property with a specific purpose. He came up beside her and looked at the two men and at the paper the one was still holding. I heard, he said. He didn't look at her, just at the men. Tell Briggs no. The man with the paper shifted his weight. Mr. Cross, if you think about it. I've thought about it, Gideon said. For 2 years, while his company filed claims against my land and sent men to deliver papers to my employee and burned my barn. His voice was very even. Tell him no, and tell him to have his lawyer ready for April. The man looked at his partner. The partner looked at the ground. You sure about that? The first man said. Not threatening, exactly. Just the specific tone of someone communicating a range of possible outcomes. Take that paper with you when you go, Gideon said. We don't need it. They left. Evelyn stood beside Gideon and watched them ride out through the gate. The mud in the yard was soft and taking the hoofprints clearly, and the creek was running high and loud over its stones, and the new lumber on the barn smelled like pine sap and fresh work. He's worried, she said. I know. Worried men do things. Before the court date, in the time between, I know, he said again. We'll be careful. He turned and looked at the barn and then at her. Thank you for coming out. You would have done the same. He looked at her for a moment with the particular look she'd stopped trying not to notice, the direct one that stayed a second longer than was strictly informational. Yes, he said. I would have. He went back to the south pasture. She went back inside to her letter to Margaret Whitlock, and she wrote at the bottom, They've made a final offer and been refused. I believe we should expect something between now and April. We should be prepared for it to be worse than the barn. Margaret Whitlock's reply came 4 days later. It said, among other things, I have made arrangements. You will not be alone in this, and I have spoken to Nan. Babs. The night before the hearing, Evelyn could not sleep. She lay in the dark of her room and listened to the house settling and the creek running and tried to make her mind do the organized, practical thing she'd trained it to do over the past months, to take the situation apart and look at each piece and assess it clearly. She could do that with the documents, with the survey, with the timeline of Briggs's claims, and Voss's social operations. She could do it with the legal strategy Garrett had laid out, the order of witnesses, the exhibits. She could not do it with the image of herself in a courtroom, not because she was afraid to speak. She'd been honest about that, and it was true. She was not fundamentally afraid to say in public what had happened to her. What moved in her, lying in the dark, was something subtler and harder to name. The particular vulnerability of being seen in the full context of your own worst situation. Arriving in a strange town in a wedding dress because a man had lied to her. Walking into a saloon because she had nowhere else to go. Being grabbed by the arm in a room full of men who were not going to intervene. Whatever Briggs's lawyers made of that, whatever word they found for the woman who had traveled west to marry a stranger, ended up in a saloon and was now living on a widower's ranch, she would have to sit in that room and hear it and remain steady. She heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside her door. A knock. Light. Evelyn? Gideon's voice, quiet. She sat up. I'm awake. A pause. I know. Another pause. There's coffee, if you want it. She got up and put on her robe and went to the kitchen. He was at the table with 2 cups. She sat down across from him, and they both held their coffee and looked at the table and didn't say anything for a while. The stove gave off its low, steady heat, and the house was quiet around them. Are you all right? He said. I will be, she said. Tomorrow. He nodded slowly. He turned his cup in his hands. I've been thinking, he said, and stopped. She waited. When this is over, he said, whatever way it goes, there's something I want to say before you're in that room tomorrow, in case the saying is easier now than after. He looked at the table. When you came here, I told you it was room and board and $8 a month and teaching my boys. I remember. That's not what it's been. He looked up. His eyes were steady, that clear gray that was honest without being easy to read. You've kept my accounts and my household and argued with my pride about it when it needed arguing with. And you've worked out what Briggs was doing when I'd been staring at it for 2 years without seeing it. And you've gotten Seth reading things he'd never have read and gotten Sam to stay at a table past the time he was supposed to. He paused. And you stood in a yard in February and went into a burning barn. Ushiti besat shin shaman. She looked at him. Gideon? I'm not saying it to settle a debt, he said. I'm saying it because tomorrow you're going into a room and you're going to stand up for this family and this land, and I want you to know. He stopped, started again. I want you to know that I see what you've done, all of it, and that you are not a woman who is here because she had nowhere else to go. You're here because this is where you belong. A pause, quiet as the room around them. That's what I wanted to say. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp made the kitchen small and warm, and she was aware, with the clear-eyed part of herself, that this was one of those moments that would be a marker point, the kind you could later divide your life at, before and after. She was also aware that she was tired, and tomorrow was going to be the hardest day she'd had since the train platform, and that some things could wait for the right time, rather than settling in the kitchen at midnight before a court date. Thank you, she said. And then, because it was true and he'd been honest and she could be too. I feel the same way about being here. She held his gaze. We can talk more about that after tomorrow. He looked at her. Something in his face settled. Not disappointment, not anything close to it. More like a man who had been carrying something at arm's length and had set it down in a place he trusted. After tomorrow, he said. They drank their coffee. The stove burned low. Outside, the April night was clear and cold, and the creek was running full from the spring melt, its sound steady through the dark, the sound of water that had been there for years and intended to keep going. The courtroom in Billings was larger than Harland Creek's entire main street. It smelled of wood oil and old paper and the particular human density of a room that had absorbed a great many consequential moments and held on to the residue. Every seat was filled. Evelyn had not expected that. The people, the number of them, the sense of the room is a thing that had weight. She found Margaret Whitlock in the second row, flanked by her lawyer and a woman Evelyn recognized after a moment as Nan. Nan was very straight in her chair and very pale, and when her eyes met Evelyn's, she nodded, once, with the careful dignity of someone who had decided something costly. Gideon was beside her at the plaintiff's table. The Hennessy's were 2 rows back, all 4 of them, the eldest son with his jaw set. The certified survey documents were in a leather case at Garrett's elbow. Harland Briggs was across the room. She looked at him directly, the first time she'd seen him. He was older than she'd expected, heavy-set, with the untroubled face of a man accustomed to outcomes being managed in his favor. He didn't look at her. Sterling Voss was in the back row. She saw him when she turned to look at the room. He was watching her with the same expression he'd used on the sidewalk in Harland Creek, the considering expression, the one that was meant to communicate that he wasn't worried. She looked at him for 2 full seconds, and then she looked away. She had said everything she intended to say to Sterling Voss in a saloon in November, and what was left, she would say here. Garrett called her third. She walked to the witness stand and sat down and looked at the room. All those faces. The Hennessy family. The women who had come from other places like her. The people of Harland Creek who had seen the fire or heard about it or been told to mind their own business about it for 2 years. She looked at Seth and Sam, who were in the 3rd row with Mrs. Phelps, and Seth gave her a nod that was somehow exactly like Gideon's, the same compact, confident gesture. And Sam, who was looking at his hands, looked up at the last second and met her eyes. Garrett asked his questions and she answered them. She was precise and calm, and she did not use more words than she needed. She told him what had happened on the train platform, in the hotel, in the general store, at the church. She told him what Nan had told her at the noon table, and what Voss's hand on her arm had felt like, and what the room full of men not looking had looked like from inside it. She said it all in a plain, clear voice, because the facts were damning enough without ornamentation. and because she had learned from 3 months of keeping records that the most powerful thing you could do with the truth was present it without apology. Briggs's lawyer was a large man with a loud voice and the particular brand of aggressive pleasantness that lawyers deployed when they intended to be unpleasant. He asked her whether she had gone willingly into the saloon. He asked her whether she had accepted lodging there and on what terms. He asked her whether it was not the case that she was a woman who had come west to marry a man she'd never met and ended up, as a result, in a compromised position that was, at its root, a consequence of her own choices. She let him finish every question. "I went into the saloon because I was cold and I had nowhere else to go," she said. "Because your client and his associates control the social and commercial life of Harland Creek in a way that makes it impossible for a vulnerable person to find alternatives." She looked at the lawyer without heat. "As for my choices, I made the best choices I could with the information available to me, in the same way that every person in this room has done and will continue to do. The difference is that the information I was working with had been deliberately manipulated by men who profit from women having nowhere else to turn." She paused. "That is not a consequence of my choices. That is a consequence of theirs." The room was very quiet. The lawyer tried 2 more questions and got answers with the same quality. Precise, undefensive, addressing the thing beneath the question rather than just the question. And then he sat down with the expression of a man who has poked at something and found it solid all the way through. Garrett called Nan next. Nan was in the stand for 40 minutes, and what she said was quiet and detailed, and had the particular authority of someone telling a story they had carried alone for a long time and were finally permitted to set down in a place where it would be recorded. When she was done, 3 women in the gallery had stopped pretending they weren't crying, and the room had a different quality than it had when the session started. The documents came in after that. The survey, the pattern of trust filings, the prior Alderton shared address. Garrett laid it out with the methodical precision of a man who had been building this structure for 8 months and knew where every beam was. He called a land surveyor from Billings who had reviewed the original grant and the subsequent claims and testified that the surveying error alleged by the trust did not exist in the documentation and appeared to have been fabricated. He called a records clerk from the territorial capital, who confirmed the certified copies Gideon had brought back were accurate reproductions of the unaltered originals. He called the eldest Hennessy's son, who testified in a voice that shook slightly at the start and steadied as he went. He called Gideon last. Gideon was not a natural speaker. He was not comfortable in that chair in the way that men who deal in words are comfortable, and he did not try to be. He answered Garrett's questions directly and without ornamentation, and when Briggs's lawyer tried to rattle him with rapid-fire questions about the financial state of the ranch, he said, "My ranch is in the state it's in because 2 years of legal harassment by your client's company has consumed the resources I would have put into it." "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." Briggs's lawyer changed direction. "Mr. Cross," he said with the pleasant aggressive tone, "the woman who testified earlier, Miss Hartwell, she lives on your property." "She works on my property," Gideon said. "She teaches my sons and keeps my household. She arrived in Harland Creek in November as a mail-order bride whose arrangement had fallen through." "She arrived in Harland Creek in November," Gideon said, "and was refused shelter by every establishment in town because your client's associate controls the social environment of that town in a way that makes it hostile to people without local connections. She found employment with me. That is the complete and accurate description of her situation." "Some might say the arrangement is—" "I know what some might say," Gideon said. His voice was still even. "Some might also say that what those people find interesting is less important than the fact that my barn was burned in February and that your client's company filed a claim against my property 9 days before it burned, and that the same company has spent 2 years filing fraudulent claims designed to bleed my resources until I had no choice but to sell." He looked at the lawyer. "Some might say that's the more relevant conversation. Briggs's lawyer sat down. The judge, who had been listening through all of it with the expression of a man assembling a structure in his head as the pieces came in, called a recess at noon. Evelyn sat in the hall with Gideon and the boys and Margaret Whitlock and didn't talk much because there wasn't much to say. Either the structure held or it didn't. They'd built it as well as they could with what they had. When the session resumed, Briggs's lawyers made their case.
They were competent and well-prepared, and they had the advantage of representing a man with money and an established position, and they used those advantages fully. They cast doubt on the arson connection. No direct evidence, they said. No witnesses to who had started the fire. They characterized the pattern of trust filings as standard business practice. Aggressive, perhaps, but legal. They positioned Alderton as an independent attorney whose poor performance was his own professional failure, not evidence of arrangement. They did not, Evelyn noticed, spend much time on Voss and the women. What they said about that was brief and dismissive, and they moved past it quickly, which told her something about what they thought the room would do with it if they lingered. The judge took the evening and returned the following morning. He was thorough. He went through the evidence in the order it had been presented, and his assessment of it, which took 40 minutes, and which Evelyn sat through in the kind of stillness that was not calm, but the effort to remain calm. He found that the Harland Valley Land Trust's water rights claim was unsupported by the documented survey and must be dismissed. He found that the pattern of filings constituted a coordinated campaign of legal harassment with fraudulent intent. He found that James Alderton's conduct warranted referral to the Bar Association for investigation. He found that Sterling Voss's conduct toward multiple women, whose testimony had been consistent and credible, constituted criminal coercion and fraud, and would be referred to the county prosecutor with his recommendation for prosecution. He awarded damages to the Cross property and the Hennessy property. He dismissed all outstanding claims filed by the Harland Valley Land Trust. He looked over his glasses at Harlan Briggs when he finished and said, in the dry tone of a man who had formed an opinion and was only partly expressing it, "Mr. Briggs, I recommend you conduct your future business dealings with considerably more attention to the distinction between acquisition and predation." The room let out a long breath. Gideon sat very still beside her. She could feel, without looking, the quality of his stillness. Not relief exactly, because it had been a long 2 years and the barn was still only partly rebuilt, and the herd was still smaller than it should be, and none of that was instantly different. But the weight, the specific grinding weight of 2 years of being pushed from a direction you couldn't fully see and couldn't get ahead of, that was lifting. She looked at Seth and Sam in the third row. Seth was looking at his father with an expression she wasn't going to analyze because it was his. Sam was looking at the ceiling with his jaw working, and then he looked down and caught her eye and gave her a small, fierce nod. Gideon turned to her. She looked at him. "After tomorrow," he said. That was what we said. "It's tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those clear gray eyes that she'd been reading for 3 months and understanding better each week, and then he said simply, "Stay." She thought about a train platform and a wedding dress and $63. She thought about a wagon going north in the dark with 2 silent boys on the seat and stars that were so bright it hurt to look at them. She thought about a room that had been cleaned before she arrived by a man who didn't know her and had decided to be ready for whoever she turned out to be. "I was planning to," she said. They rode home from Billings in the same wagon they'd come in, the 4 of them, with the April sky going wide and pale over the valley as the town fell behind them and the familiar road north opened up ahead. Nobody talked much for the first hour. That was all right. There are kinds of silence that are emptiness and kinds that are fullness, and what sat in that wagon on the road back from the circuit court was the second kind, the quiet of people who have been through something together and don't need to perform their feelings about it for each other. Sam fell asleep against Seth's shoulder somewhere around the 3rd mile, which was the most honest thing anyone had done all day. Seth let him sleep without comment and looked out at the hills with the expression of a boy who was quietly revising his understanding of how the world worked. Not shattered, not disillusioned, but recalibrated. Like a compass that had been checked and found accurate. Gideon drove. Evelyn sat beside him on the wagon seat with her coat pulled close and watched the valley come back to them in pieces. The particular shape of the hills she'd memorized without meaning to. The bend in the road where you first saw the creek glinting in the distance. The fence line that marked the edge of the Phelps property, and then the gap where the crossland began. When they came over to the last rise and the ranch house appeared below them, Gideon slowed the horses without being asked. They sat there a moment, looking down at it. The house with its 2 chimneys. The barn, half original and half new lumber, the joins still visible, probably would be for years.
the creek moving quick and silver through the property's lower edge. "It doesn't look different," Sam said. He was awake again, or had been awake for a while, watching. "I thought it would look different." "Nothing happened to it," Seth said. "Things happened," Sam said. "I just thought it would show." Evelyn looked at the ranch and understood what Sam was trying to say, that it felt like the inside of something had changed, and the outside should reflect it. She understood that feeling. She'd had it before. "It shows in other ways," she said. "It just takes time to see." Gideon made a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement. He moved the horses on. The practical aftermath of winning a court case turned out to be nearly as much work as the fighting. The damage award from the court, assessed against the Harland Valley Land Trust's assets, which Garrett had frozen as part of the proceedings, came in pieces over the following weeks. The first portion arrived in May. It was not a fortune. It was enough. Enough to rebuild the barn properly and restock the herd to something closer to its previous size and pay down the debt that 2 years of Alderton's fees had accumulated. There was a remainder, modest but real, that Gideon put in the bank in Billings with the grimly satisfied expression of a man restoring something to its rightful place. Harland Briggs left the valley before summer. Not dramatically, not in disgrace in any visible public way. Men with money rarely went that way. They just quietly relocated their operations to places where the local situation hadn't turned against them. The Harland Valley Land Trust's remaining assets were sold off. The county assessor resigned his position in June, and no one in the valley was particularly surprised. Sterling Voss was a different story. The prosecutor moved on him in May, and the proceedings were slower and messier and more contested than the civil case had been, because Voss knew how to work a town's social dynamics, and because the women who testified against him, Nan and 2 others who had come forward after the Billings hearing, were subjected to the kind of sustained character questioning that the law permitted, and that was, regardless of its legality, a designed cruelty. Evelyn had already given her account in Billings and was not required to testify again in the county proceeding, but she went to Harland Creek on the days when Nan was in the witness chair and sat in the gallery where Nan could see her, because sometimes that was the thing you could do, and it was not nothing. Voss was convicted in August. The sentence was 4 years. When the verdict came out, Nan was standing on the courthouse steps in the flat late summer light, and Evelyn stood beside her, and Nan said, very quietly, "I didn't think it would actually happen." "I know," Evelyn said. "I've been in places before where it didn't happen." "I know that too." Nan was quiet for a moment. She'd been offered a position at the general store by Mrs. Carmichael, who had apparently been doing her own long recalibration about what she could and couldn't do for people in her town. She'd taken it. "What do you do with it after?" she said. "When it's done." Evelyn thought about that honestly. "I think you just keep going," she said. "Not like it didn't happen. Just forward. One thing and then the next." She paused. "That's all I've been doing." Nan looked at her sideways. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," Evelyn said, "but it's the only direction that works." She married Gideon Cross on a Saturday in September in the yard of the ranch with Mrs. Phelps and Margaret Whitlock and the Hennessy family and Mrs. Carmichael and a number of other people in attendance who had decided they were coming whether or not they were invited, which in the end they were. The justice of the peace from Harland Creek performed the ceremony. It was brief and direct, which suited both of them. She did not wear her mother's dress. She had considered it, had taken it out of the traveling case and laid it on the bed and looked at it for a while. But the dress had made that other journey, the one that ended on a platform in the dust with a letter from a stranger in her hand, and she felt that the dress had done its work and didn't need to be asked to do more. She wore instead a dress she had made herself from fabric she'd ordered from Billings, dark blue, practical enough to work in, good enough for a ceremony, hers entirely. The wedding dress she folded back carefully and put away. Not thrown out, not burned, just set aside, because things that have carried you through something have a weight you don't discard lightly, even when they belong to the past. The boys were there, of course. Sam wore his good shirt without being told, and then spent most of the ceremony looking at his boots with the expression of a child who has decided that displays of sentiment are beneath him but is being ambushed by one anyway. Seth stood straight and looked directly at both of them when the justice of the peace said the words, with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely honest, And that was, Evelyn thought, exactly the way Seth Cross would look at things for the rest of his life, clearly, without flinching, taking in what was true. When it was done and people were talking and eating what had collectively materialized from the assembled guests, Gideon found her at the edge of the yard, looking at the creek. "All right?" he said. "Very," she said. He stood beside her. The creek was low in September, lazy over its stones, nothing like the fierce April current that had been running the day they came back from court. Different versions of the same water, depending on what the season asked of it. "You're thinking something," he said. "I'm always thinking something. Something specific." She looked at the creek, and then at the hills beyond it, and then at the yard behind them with all its people. Margaret Whitlock was talking to the eldest Hennessy son with the focused intensity of a woman who conducted even social occasions as productive meetings. Sam had found another child his age, one of the Hennessy grandchildren, and they were doing something involving a stick and a disputed territory of grass that would probably end in an argument and possibly in a friendship. Seth was sitting on the porch steps reading, because Seth read at every available opportunity, including his father's wedding, which was not a criticism so much as a fact about Seth. "I want to build a school," she said. Gideon looked at her. "Not on the ranch. In Harland Creek. A proper one, with a building and books and enough space for the children who need it." She turned to look at him. "There are families in this valley who can't afford the schooling fees from Billings. There are children who haven't been in a classroom since they came west. Some of them—" She thought about Sam and his hidden arithmetic, his elaborate self-concealment about what he was capable of. "Some of them have things in them that no one has taken the time to find." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup in his hands, the slow rotation she knew by now as the outward sign of him thinking carefully. "The damage award," he said slowly. "There's the remainder." "I know. That's why I brought it up today." He looked at her. "You've been planning this for a while." "Since January," she said. "Maybe longer." He was quiet again. The creek moved over its stones, unhurried. "Harland Creek's not going to make it easy," he said. "There'll be people who say—" "There are always people who say things," she said. "We've established that we can survive it." A pause. "You'd want to teach there?" "Part of the time." "Yes." He nodded. Once, slowly, the way he had nodded on the porch months ago when she'd said she'd be here for the boys while he went to the Capitol. The nod of a man recognizing something true and deciding to stand behind it. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "That's it? All right? What else would I say?" She turned back to the creek. "I thought you might argue." "I might have once," he said, "but I've been wrong before, and I've noticed you tend to know what you're talking about." He was quiet for a moment. "Besides, the boys need real schooling, not just you and a geography book missing 40 pages. She made a sound. "The geography book has been replaced." "By Seth memorizing its replacement." She looked at him. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, the expression she'd cataloged carefully over the months. The almost smile, the one that didn't quite complete itself but was there, undeniably there. She had been loved once before, or thought she had, through 11 letters and a set of promises that turned out to be performances. She understood now the difference between that and this. Love that was made of paper was easy to carry because it weighed nothing. This was heavier. The weight of a man you actually knew, with his silences and his pride and his burned biscuits and his hand on the back of his son's neck in a dark kitchen. A man who had faults she could name specifically and who knew hers. That weight was not a burden. It was what let you know the thing was real. "Thank you," she said. "For the school." "Thank you," he said. "For the rest of it. Time." The Harland Creek Schoolhouse opened the following spring, in a building that had previously been a feed storage facility and had been converted over the winter by Gideon and the Hennessy men and several others who had apparently decided that the project was worth their time. Margaret Whitlock funded a third of it, which she did without ceremony or expectation of acknowledgement. Though she did come to the opening and look at the building with the assessing eye, she gave everything and said it was adequate, which from her was essentially a standing ovation. There were 14 children on the first day. By the end of the first year, there were 22, from 7 different families, including 3 who had been turned away from the church school in Harland Creek the previous year for reasons that were not spoken plainly, but had to do with their family's financial circumstances. Evelyn taught mornings. A young woman from Billings, a trained teacher hired through Garrett's recommendation, handled afternoons. It was not perfect. The building leaked in heavy rain until Gideon fixed the roof in autumn. Two families pulled their children for a month in summer over a social dispute that had nothing to do with the school and resolved itself. The books were never as many as Evelyn wanted. The funding was always a negotiation. None of that was the point. The point was that every morning there were children at those desks who had not been at any desks the year before, and that some of them were Sam, sitting in the back of the room with the self-conscious nonchalance of a boy who was going to pretend he wasn't learning something, even as he clearly was. He did not, ultimately, become a reader. He became what Evelyn had predicted: a builder, a surveyor, a man who worked with his hands and his mathematics in ways that were practical and excellent and entirely his own. He left for Billings at 18 to apprentice with an engineer, and he wrote home with the painstaking regularity of a person who knew that writing mattered, even if it wasn't natural. And his letters were short and specific, and contained occasional questions that showed he'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to ask it. He was not transformed into someone he wasn't. He was, instead, more fully what he had always been. Seth read everything. He became a lawyer, eventually, which surprised no one who had watched him ask quiet questions about land surveys at 12 years old. He worked for several years in Billings and then came back to the Valley, which was the choice of a man who had gone far enough to understand what he was choosing when he returned. His first case involved a land dispute in the northern part of the Valley. He won it. The world, Evelyn had come to understand, did not reward goodness reliably or justice consistently. That was the true version of things, the one that wasn't softened for easier digestion. Harland Briggs relocated and continued his business elsewhere, with different names on the paperwork. There were other towns without a Margaret Whitlock watching the pattern, without a woman who happened to know how to read accounts and had the particular stubbornness not to look away. The machinery that had operated in Harland Creek didn't end because they had dismantled one instance of it. It just moved. That was the thing you had to hold alongside the rest of it. That winning one fight didn't mean the fight was over. It just meant you'd won that one. The people who came after you would face their version of it, and the best thing you could do for them was leave something useful behind. A school, a precedent, a record that someone had stood in a courtroom and said plainly what was true and had been believed. That was worth doing, not because it fixed everything, because it was worth doing anyway. There was an evening in late October, several years after the trial, that Evelyn remembered afterward as the kind of evening you didn't know you were inside while it was happening. She was on the porch with Gideon, which was still a thing they did when the season permitted. The valley was going gold and rust, the aspens on the hills catching the last light of the afternoon in a way that was briefly extraordinary. The ranch was quiet around them, the animals settled, the barn solid and whole, the creek low and contemplative in the way it got in autumn. Gideon had a coffee. She had a coffee. They were looking at the valley. "Do you ever think about it?" he said. "The way it was, when you came." She knew what he meant. The platform, the letter, the cold November night, and the wagon going north in the dark. "Sometimes," she said. "How does it seem to you now?" She thought about that genuinely, the way she'd learned he preferred, not the reassuring answer, the actual one. "Necessary," she said, after a moment. "Not in the way people mean when they say things happen for a reason, because I'm not sure I believe that. But," she paused, "everything I am now was built from what I was then. The same person, just with more." She looked at the valley. "I wouldn't give back the more, even if giving it back also meant giving back the bad parts." He was quiet for a while. The light was moving on the hills, that slow horizontal drift of autumn afternoon. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that when Martha died, that was the shape things would have from then on. 3 people in a house with something missing at the center." He turned his cup in his hands. "I'd accepted it." She looked at him. "I'm glad I was wrong," he said. She thought about what it cost a man like Gideon Cross to say that, a man who didn't say things unless he meant them and didn't mean things carelessly. She thought about the 11 letters in the stove and the $63 and the stars over the wagon road and the note that had said, "Voss is not your problem," and all the small specific things that had led from that train platform to this porch, this valley, this man beside her who was difficult and good and entirely real. "So am I," she said. The creek moved below the house, quiet in the dry autumn. The hills went gold and then amber, and then the light left them and they became their evening shapes, familiar and steady, the fixed points of a landscape she had come to know as well as she'd ever known anything. She had arrived in Harland Creek with nothing but herself, and it had turned out that herself was enough. That was not a small thing. It was in fact the only thing, the one truth she would carry out of all of it, the thing she tried, when she could, to show the children at the school. Not that the world was fair, because it wasn't. Not that good people were always protected, because they weren't. But that what you had inside you, the capacity to look at a situation clearly, to do the next thing and the next thing, to tell the truth in a room full of people who wanted you to stay quiet, that was yours. It couldn't be taken by a man who didn't show up to his own wedding, or by a saloon owner with a practiced smile, or by 2 years of legal filings designed to grind you down to nothing. It was the one thing that was actually yours. And it was, if you used it, enough. The porch held them in the evening quiet. The valley went dark by degrees and the first stars came out. Not the violent brightness of that first November night in the wagon, but something steadier. The reliable stars of a sky you'd watched long enough to know by name. Somewhere down the road, in the schoolhouse in Harland Creek, there were books on shelves and desks in rows and chalk marks on a board where tomorrow's lesson was already written, waiting for the children who would come in the morning not knowing yet what they were capable of. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.